Thank you for having me. And before I start, I just want to say what a great group of local government leaders we have in BayREN. I have a little bit of bias. I used to work on the program when I was with Stop Waste years ago, but it's just great to see your local leadership and all the high caliber programs and products you put out, um, especially in this time when, local governments and governments in general are kind of under scrutiny and environmental regulations. It's great to see the leadership here on this group. So thank you for having me. And yep, I'm Wes. I work at U.S. Green Building Council. We are a national nonprofit. We work internationally too. And we work primarily, what you're probably familiar with, is the LEED rating system. That's what we work on to develop this rating system for, it's a voluntary rating system for buildings, infrastructure. We also have programs for zero waste, which Contra Costa County has been one of the first pilots to show zero waste. So anyway, happy to be here and talk about one of my favorite topics, which is embodied carbon. Now, before we get too far, I just want to level set what is embodied carbon. I think it's generally been conveyed here, but visually, embodied carbon is all the emissions that happen before a building is in use and operational. So it's the extraction, the harvesting, the manufacturing, delivery to job sites, all the emissions that go, the energy and inputs that go into making the materials that make up our buildings and the construction process. There's also the end of life considerations. Things like, do you recycle the material? Does it go to landfill? Can it be circular, et cetera? So those are all the embodied impacts of materials in buildings. And typically our policies have been focusing on operational, but in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been an increased focus on embodied carbon. And you might ask why that is. Well, the next slide I'll share just kind of a snapshot of the global stage of where emissions are at. And the globally around 11% of greenhouse gas related emissions are attributed to building materials. Now that's at least, I should say, because we've seen studies that go higher than that. And in California in particular, it's probably much higher. But at least they're about 11% of global emissions, which is a big chunk of the GHG related pie. On the next slide, you'll see some more recent data. I borrowed this from our friends at CARB, their resources board. They had a webinar workshop last week talking about efforts they're doing to cut down on embodied carbon of materials. And they shared this stat that essentially as California's building codes and requirements require, near zero or close to zero emission buildings, operating buildings with renewables and our renewable standards for all of our fuels and things like that in buildings, the embodied chunk of the pie of overall emissions has been growing and is now approaching something like half of all emissions from buildings. Now, this study they referenced was from a subset of like 30 or so non-residential buildings and some residential. So it's by no means like a cut and dry subject, but somewhere on the magnitude of half of the emissions come from embodied carbon in California's new building stock, which is a huge number. And again, as buildings get more efficient, those operational emissions are shrinking, but the embodied are going up. On the next slide, this question of what do we tackle first, operational or embodied? And the answer is it's no competition. We have to do both, because a high embodied carbon building with low operating carbon still has a lot of emissions overall. Conversely, that kind of middle line, if you have a low embodied carbon building, but it's got high operational energy, then you have, again, high total carbon emissions. But what we need are buildings that do both. They're low carbon up front in the embodied carbon. They're low operational. There's end of life issues that you can take to recapture those emissions and put them back in the system, and you end up with total lower emissions overall. And in addition to that, the next slide is there's no kind of one single thing you can do to cut embodied carbon, but it's really a combination of interventions that result in the deepest reductions. And so you need to do things like consider reusing a building or salvaging the materials, building your building more compactly or optimizing the structure so that you're not over-engineering the concrete or the steel or whatever that might be. And then once you're in the phase of actually designing the building, go and select the lowest GWP products possible. On the next slide, I'll give you a second to snap this QR code, but this is a study we did with RMI, and I'll just wait here for it to come up. There it is, thank you. USGBC and RMI released this report at the end of 2023 on driving action and embodied carbon in buildings. And all the infographics you just saw were from that report, and I encourage you to check that out as part of a way to learn more about how to reduce embodied carbon in buildings. So I'll give you a second to snap that that QR card. Thank you. Let's see. So shifting from the kind of what is and why to how programs can reduce embodied carbon, let's talk a little bit about CALGreen. So on the next slide, you'll see just some fanfare for our green building code, which is now 16 years old, and CALGreen has been in effect as a mandatory requirement for buildings throughout the state. And this is really, it was the first code in the nation to address green buildings. And just last year, they started requiring embodied carbon reduction measures. And the way this applies, it was meant to be a modest entry into this space because there's a lot of, there's quite a learning curve for our industry to pick up the embodied carbon strategies and how to cut and reduce them. So it started with a modest attempt at applying embodied carbon reductions to the largest buildings first. So 100,000 square feet and up non-residential new construction buildings are covered under this code requirement. For schools, the threshold is 50,000 square feet, and that all started July 1st of last year. Now, starting in 2026, the idea is that threshold will ratchet down to 50,000 square feet, and projects will have to meet one of the three pathways to cut embodied carbon emissions: building reuse, whole building LCA, or a prescriptive approach using EPDs. The next slide, I'll show kind of a deeper dive into the first path. Building reuse, that's I'd say the highest and best thing you can do is reuse a building, because if you don't need to build new, you certainly are emitting a lot less embodied carbon than getting all those materials new. And so it was recognized that a significant reuse, like I would even say, 30, 40, 50% of building reuse would be well and good, and you wouldn't have to do any of the additional pathways to to cut embodied carbon emissions from buildings. So the state recognized this by putting in an easy path, if you will, showing that if a project team reuses 45% more or more of the structure and enclosure, they do not need to do the rest of the code measures. That it is sufficient for saving embodied carbon. The second path is whole building life cycle analysis. And it's like doing an energy model for your building, where you come up with a baseline, you use software typically to show a baseline of what the building you're building would have been if it met all the kind of just industry average values for embodied carbon. And then you do a comparative assessment of that, showing reductions from choosing more or better products that have lower embodied carbon, or better strategies like dematerialization or lightweighting of elements of the building, things like that. And whole building LCA is requiring the project to analyze the structural things like footings, foundations, columns, beams, things like that, and some of the enclosure components that have some of the highest embodied carbon. These requirements do align with the LEED rating system. That was intentional because probably the most whole building LCAs that have been done in California have been on LEED buildings so far, on those larger buildings. Now, the third pathway that's included in this code is EPDs. EPDs are basically kind of a nutrition label for products, where it displays on a document the global warming potential, the GWP it's called, of each material. And in the code, you have to basically show that you're doing not too much worse than industry average. So it's an interesting thing. They say 175% of industry average. So you cannot be that much worse than some of the average products. It's not a total reduction yet, but it's the idea of getting folks used to the language of EPDs, collecting this data, getting it from manufacturers and concrete suppliers and such, and then putting it all together in a way to document that you're meeting or beating the limits there shown on screen. So the way it's listed is you have to, for each material that's on the left column, you have to meet the GWP limit or exceed it, meaning reduce it, and compile those all together to show that you're hitting the target. Now, an EPD, on the next slide, I just put an example of what an EPD is, because they can be kind of daunting to find the information, but they're typically a PDF or something. They're getting more digital as the days go by. But you'll have a product from a manufacturer like this one, and it'll have some analysis and maybe a diagram or something that talks about the processes to make a product. And then there's tables of results, like the one you see at the bottom middle, showing global warming potential and other impacts, because an EPD looks at not just global warming potential or GHGs, but also things that affect the life cycle, pollution, eutrophication, smog, things like that from the life cycle of a product. And then there's lots of signatures and standards that have to be followed. So EPDs have to follow a number of rules to make sure they're credible and can be used in CALGreen and other places. So beyond that, there is action happening on codes at the local and federal action. There's the Buy Clean California Act, which came out probably one of the first in the country, which requires the state to procure specific materials that are lower embodied carbon on their buildings. And that has since spread to other parts like CALGreen. There's CALGreen is kind of a reflection of some of those Buy Clean requirements into the building code. There's also some efforts by the state to further regulate that with additional legislation. And that's what the California Air Resources Board is working on right now, to create a framework for measuring carbon. That's the bottom left slide. And by December 2028, they'll have a strategy to reduce emissions with a goal of a 40% reduction of those covered projects and materials by 2035. So very ambitious. There is some action at the federal level, although that is kind of yet to be seen, and it's on hold at the moment. For local government leadership, there are some examples of like a low carbon concrete code that was put in place in Marin County and Palo Alto. And in Embryville, there's a mass timber bonus points. Mass timber is considered low carbon compared to, say, a structure that's made of concrete or steel, although lots of mass timber also has a lot of concrete and steel, so they have to be done carefully. And you have to look at how the wood is sourced. And then just the last slide on local government leadership here are lots of climate action plans are now picking up embodied carbon measures. I have a partial list on the left. There's probably more. But the idea is that you can put these in your climate action plans as measures for local leadership as well as for private sector strategies to reduce embodied carbon. And we're seeing more of that. Last slide on this section, I have just some resources which you can have as a takeaway once these slides are out there. I'll also put these links in the chat when I'm done here. But there's some good CALGreen resources that you can view online and get more information. Now, for just the last couple of minutes here, I want to share what we're doing at the U.S. Green Building Council and LEED with the most recent version of the rating system, which is going to be in place very soon. We're in the final stages of getting members to ratify the rating system, and our goal is that by May of this year, we will have LEED version 5 out and ready to be used by the market. So we've gone through over a year of public comments and refinements of the rating system, so we're really excited to be at this point. And in LEED version 5, we have 3 major impact areas we're trying to address through the rating system. First and foremost being decarbonization. That's going to make up about 50% of all of the points and credits in our rating system, followed by quality of life and ecological conservation and restoration. And just drilling down one level deeper on decarbonization on the next slide is, what do we mean by that? Well, it really is a cross-sectional approach to decarbonization. It's, of course, things like energy efficiency, electrification, renewables, also refrigerants, but we're tackling embodied carbon as well. The structure and enclosure, the materials we make our buildings out of, those are all now part of the rating system to gather points. And we have a new prerequisite. Prerequisites are things that you have to do to get certified. And then a lot of voluntary points are on top of that. But for the prerequisite to measure their embodied carbon of their structure, enclosure, and hardscape. So that's a big new thing that hasn't been in LEED before. And we're excited to get that out into the market. We also tackle things like transportation emissions and how people get to buildings in the site as well, some of the landscaping and hardscapes. There's ways to address those and reduce carbon and get credit for it in the rating system. The next slide is not one I expect you to be able to read very carefully, but it's a snapshot of the scorecard for this next version of the rating system. And it has, if you're familiar with LEED, there are typical kind of categories you see there, like sustainable sites and water efficiency, energy and atmosphere. And under materials, there are a number of points there. You see one on reduce embodied carbon, and there's the prereq up top. But there really are a bunch of points now, probably about 15 or so points that target embodied carbon in LEED version 5. Another way to look at this is we have also provided this link or a list of LEED credits by their impact areas, those three I mentioned. And so you can see on the left there under decarbonization, it's kind of a rainbow of colors because there are decarbonization strategies throughout almost every credit category. And there's an emphasis on, again, energy and materials, but also on the site and other places as well. So we hope it'll be a really useful rating system for the market, and we're excited to launch it soon. So on the next slide, there's a QR code to go for learning more about LEED version 5. With that, though, I think I'll pass it over to our next speaker, and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thanks, Wes.